Howdy y'all, D.EN.A here. Welcome to the show where I tell you why you should or shouldn't play a deck in way too much detail. As always, we'll be talking about gameplay, core engine, with the deck example of course, accessibility, how fun it is, and more. So strap in for an absolute yapper while we ask, should you play Insectoids? So Bugs is a control-centric deck that operates on all angles that it needs to for a list that doesn't use security like how Yellow Vaccine does, or options like how Security Control does. Most of the bugs in this list are able to swing over any Digimon that thinks they're safe, because Tyrant can get all the way up to 20k very easily, and with so many Digimon in this list that can suspend your opponent down, they really can't hide behind being unsuspended. It can pop Tamers that your opponent is trying to gain value with through using Grand Koaga, and extremely importantly, it can redirect attacks to the insurmountable Tyrant using Izzy and Metal Life. The combination of these forms of control really forces some extremely difficult decisions for your opponent to make. Essentially, the best explanation of the kind of gameplay that you'll be trying to get out of Bugs is attrition. Constantly eating your opponent's resources like a bug, whilst they try to out a Digimon that is almost always unaffected by effects. And if they do out it with an option, it will usually be an A cost, which is just giving us more fuel to the fire, a lot more to work with to bring out a second Tyrant. And if they had a hard time dealing with the first one, the second one's really gonna get to them. So this is the core engine part of the video. These are just the cards that I think that you absolutely need to run in the deck. And this is just my opinion, but yeah, let's get straight into it. I wanted to put Modimon here as a core piece of the puzzle because I've seen some people running Nyaramon as their egg, and obviously, just fully my opinion, I just disagree with that. Any game where I had to freeball a stack from a level 4, I'd be thinking to myself, man, if I had Modimon here, I'd be able to just absolutely destroy my opponent's Digimon just by ending my turn getting into the bigger stack. So I really think that Modimon has an extremely good place in this deck. The only issue is that he doesn't have any card draw. You could run something like Gummimon instead if you wanted to, which gives card draw when you suspend an opponent's Digimon, which I think is still a good option and maybe something that I'd have to try out in the future as even a 5th egg, because sometimes these games do go for so long because it's control. Okay, so Tento's up next. Green rookies have come so far in the last 2 sets, dude. Having a free Samadhi Santi on a body, aka being able to suspend any Digimon coming straight out of raising, catches so many people off guard. Not to mention, the DP buff is huge to be able to beat over everything by the time you end your turn by going into Tyrant. Then comes the Modimon swing. Okay, so Mega Kabuteri Ace is not the greatest ace among all of them by no means. So personally, I'm a big fan of running 2 to 3 if you'd like, but this is still a card that really can catch your opponent off guard if they're not already thinking about it. The only issue I have with Mega Kabu Ace is that if it's your absolutely only way to get into a stack and you just don't have another level 5, you are essentially giving them kind of a target to go for on your Tyrant or your Grand Koaga, which is a bit of an issue. You know, they can gain themselves a shitload of memory back. It's a great battle trick, just being able to buff a level 4 that maybe you had to play out of your Tyrant, and your opponent just kind of ignores that idea that it exists, and then you get to punish them for little things like that. But it's not the most ideal level 5 we have in this deck. And the other huge boon for this is that if you are a little off tempo and your opponent just killed your entire board, a 4 cost to play a level 5 is not bad. We do love it for that fact. More and more I'm really getting into the idea of like playing a level 5 for its 4 cost and then just digivolving straight into a level 6, and I really like that about aces. So Metal Life is your other level 5, and man do I love this guy. He on plays and when digivolving gains that 3k DP, he suspends something down, which just is really, really useful when you end your turn going into Tyrant and you play him out and he just suspends something that might have been an issue. It gives your Tyrant that extra DP until the end of your opponent's turn, and then you just smash over their body. It really, really works super well with the deck. And if you play it out, or it's part of the stack, the next Tyrant or the Grand Kuaga are going to be able to use its inheritable to redirect, and I absolutely love the inheritable. It's another Izzy that you don't have to pay the 4 for. Yeah, so this card is just phenomenal. I'm running it at 4 always just because I fucking love it. And here is our boy Tyrant. Obviously, I'm going to say that this card is so well worth the cost of 6. It also costs only 2 to Digivolve over a level 6, which I keep forgetting, but I feel like other people won't. So it kind of extends your plays a little bit down the line once you've played out a Grand Kuaga. But initially, I thought the 6 cost was going to be too much. And I thought that we were going to have another trash, expensive, do not enough level 6. But this guy has his cake and eats yours too. When Digivolving, we're playing out any Insectoid reduced by 8. It's so sick to just drop Grand Kuaga and pop a Tamer, bot deck a Digimon, and then in the end of turn, just swing into something with Modimon. The combination of all of these 3 things at once makes Tyrant just incredible when he hits the board. So you'll notice that the bot deck is end of your turn, once per turn, which means that it's every end of turn, which is crazy scary for your opponent. You don't need to suspend your opponent's Digimon to bot deck them. Getting to do the bot deck every turn is so nice, and realizing that your opponent's Digimon don't even need to be suspended makes doing it every turn even easier. All we need to do is just get more DP than their Digimon, and that's so easy. And if all that wasn't enough, he's unaffected by Digimon effects at all times when he's suspended. What an icing on the cake. I am loving this boss so much. I could go on about Tyrantkabuterimon for ages, but for the sake of being succinct, let's move on to Grand Kuaga, the perfect boss to go with Tyrant. This guy is almost just a second half of Tyrant's ability, but if you drop out a level 5 with Tyrant, sometimes your opponent has to walk into this Digimon's Ace effect, which can really interrupt their game plan as well. And just being able to hard play this Digimon for 7 cost as well is sometimes enough to be able to interrupt what they want to do by, for example, popping their Tamers, suspending a couple bodies, and then those can't unsuspend. Sometimes it's just enough. The only caveat I will say for Grand Kuaga here is, like the Mega Kabuteri, being an ace does kind of a detriment to this Digimon, because when your opponents target this Digimon to out it instead of Tyrant because they can't, you're just giving them a free 4 memory, which, you know, they could just play another Tamer out if they'd like, but the second half of the ability as well is really good. Just being able to give Sec +1 when it becomes suspended is phenomenal. You know, just being able to give Tyrant just a little bit of extra damage to really put the pressure on for your opponent. Not heaps to say about Izzy here. Bro just sets us to 3 every turn and helps us to block our opponent out of getting over Tyrant, a lot like Analog Man does. Just a great tamer, and I'm always happy to, you know, be able to have one on the board. And then adding more makes it even more difficult for your opponent to get through. Now I've added Kuaga here secondarily, kind of for the fact that he is a promo card. He's pretty difficult to get your hands on. He's like $40 each. So whilst I don't think this card is part of the core engine, I really do believe that this guy shores up a lot of your really gnarly matchups against some annoying stack decks. He's, you know, a 4 cost, which helps. But again, I really want to stress that I don't think that this card is absolutely necessary for the deck. There are some lists that run, you know, something else interim. I just think that this is a good card that if you wanted to play competitively, I think it's worth a spot. This guy is just good for some extra DP on your turn, but more importantly, 4 cost to play, and he will just stun your opponent down for a turn. So for example, against something like Magna X, if you're off tempo for a turn because they've cleared your board but haven't become immune to effects, you can just plop this guy out and stop them from becoming immune again, just to get that breather. Same goes for big stacks like Wargreymon. And then lastly, we have Shivamon as kind of a side note here. I see a lot of people teching 1 or 2 of Shiva in to make Tyrant essentially untouchable, but in my opinion, a lot of the time people have to use 8 cost options, except for Heaven's Judgment, just to out him. And that puts you in a pretty good spot to do whatever you like for a turn. You can set up for your next turn, you can drop a 4 cost, Digivolve for 3, and then go straight back into Tyrant to give them hell again. The world is your oyster at that point, and a Digimon you have to pay extra to drop isn't really worth the extra bit of protection you get from it, because you do have to make sure that you suspend all bodies on the field to be able to you know, make sure that your opponent can't use options, which can be a bit difficult sometimes, especially going into metas with things like Magna and Rapid. Just as a little side note, I do like the idea of having maybe one Shivamon in the deck, just for that extra little bit of aggression by trashing your opponent's security every turn. But again, paying that extra 4 memory to drop it on top of often the 6 that you had to pay for your Tyrant can be pretty detrimental to your own board anyway. You know, you don't want to give your opponent way too much memory. We don't mind giving them, you know, 4 to 6 sometimes, but giving them 9 is just asking for them to do way too much sometimes. So here's the full deck list as an example, so that if you wanna, you can just rip it and ship it when BT16 drops. This is exactly what I've been running in playtesting. If anyone wants more of a yap about the card by card in the future, I can maybe add that, but for now, here's all the ratios. Every card feels like it has a great place in the deck. I have to really give it to this deck for being rather cheap, and yet still what I think will be a heavy hitter in the next format. Spoilers. Tento, $10 AUD, Tyrant, $20 AUD in its pre-release form, and Mega Kabuteri, which is 6 AUD. That is nothing. These cards are the only SRs for what I believe is core engine, and even Mega Kabu is rarely a 4 of. Just as importantly is that all of these great cards are in BT15 and BT16, 2 of the newest sets, which is great obviously, for being really easy to pick up. Seeing as, unlike a lot of other decks that I'll be talking about in the future, you don't have to scour the depths of random sets for core pieces from, you know, BT8 and BT7. That comes with the caveat of Kabuterimon. I think that's a crazy good card, but unfortunately it is from BT7. It shouldn't be too hard to get because people who bought that set were, you know, it's an uncommon. It's not that difficult to find. The other small caveat to this is that BT15 was a bit of a trash set in terms of trying to pull SRs, but that's for another discussion. Grand Kawaga and Izzy are just rares? So nice. Obviously, the big standout here is the Kawagamon promo, which is roughly about $40 each. But again, this card is not mandatory. It just feels like it can shore up some really gnarly situations for you, and I've seen a lot of lists without it. So all in all, is the deck fun? Oh my god, this is the part where I get to go off script. I've been having so much fun on the sim with this deck by just playing over and over again into every matchup that I possibly can, because even though the gameplay loop is extremely simple in its entirety, it is really fun to just be able to walk out, suspend something down, gain a shitload of DP, hit something, and then just stare at your opponent while they have to do a 3-minute combo that takes a huge amount of complexity and effort. Initially, I thought it was a bit too simple, but as you kind of do all these workarounds for trying to understand both what your opponent is doing and how you can do your own plays better, the deck just gets more and more fun. You don't always have to be doing the same line of play. There's so many different ways that you can facilitate clearing your opponent's board, from just cracking tamers to killing massive bodies that think they're safe for the most part. Most Digimon these days have protection from, you know, being deleted or, you know, being bot decked or bounce to hand. So a deck that is built around end of turn, I'm gonna fucking hit you as hard as I can with a massive Tyrant, is a breath of fresh air to me, because things like Partition, for example, which if it were to leave the battle area, it splits into 2 little bodies, and then those 2 bodies next turn can go straight back into another D.EN.A. That just doesn't get to do what its game plan is, and you are really locking your opponent out of what it is that they want to do by creating really frustrating situations for them. So many times I've had games that go well over roughly 40 minutes, only because we don't have a timer, which are just fraught with interaction, which I have loved so much. It has been funny to just sit there and have your opponent spend 4 to 5 minutes thinking about what it is on their turn that could possibly kill your Tyrant, and or, you know, maybe just get some advantage against a deck that basically says, everything you want I will eat, and I will pop, and I will get rid of in the long term. This is obviously a difficult one to gauge going into a new format, but from the many games that I've done in testing, it has some pretty darn good matchups for a lot of decks. If I had to rate where it was on a tier list, I'd probably rate it at the bottom of tier 1 and the top of tier 2, you know, just to give you a brief idea of roughly, you know, how good this deck is. It really is able to gatekeep and shut out so many other decks that it's not funny. This deck is essentially a litmus test for, do you have the out? And if you don't, you are essentially just walking into a board of a 18k beta that can redirect all of your attacks, and if you can never go over that, you will never end the game. So let's talk about some specific matchups. Magna, I feel like I need some more testing on because it feels pretty generally good to verse, as sometimes they can't get over your Tyrant and they're just stuck until they have a turn where they're affected by effects and you can either walk over it, which is not ideal, or just bottom deck it at the end of the turn. The matchup gets a bit muddy when Heaven's Judgment gets added to the equation because that's a super simple out to Tyrant and everything else on the board. But most of the time they're only running 2, so sometimes you can just get out-tempoed by the littler Magnas. And sometimes they just can't get over your Tyrant. So it'll definitely be really interesting to see how the format progresses with this kind of information in mind. Sylphimon has a hard time DP reducing it to 0. It can't touch it at all if it's suspended, obviously. But most of the time, you're smashing over their D.EN.A so the partition doesn't go off, and it's really difficult for them to make the decision that they're going to ace when you are already hitting at 18k, and they would just be giving you another 4 memory on their, I can't remember the Sylphimon ace. So I haven't tested enough Imperial quite yet. It might definitely still be a difficult matchup with Source Stripping. Tyrant has the same strength to be able to just ignore our opponent's partition, which is nice, but we might have some issues if our opponent goes for a DP orientated build. Sometimes the fighter mode can get to 20k. Tyrant can clear 22 very easily, but it is a game of numbers. And this is definitely going to be a DP dependent format, just to be clear. So I haven't tried this matchup in particular, but what can Mirage even do to this deck with Tyrant DP buffed? You can't bounce him, you can't hit over him, and we draw no cards. It's probably a very solid matchup. Mirage is one of the highest contenders in the meta at the moment, but with Tyrant being unaffected by Digimon's effects when he is suspended, we don't have to care about almost everything that Mirage wants to interact with the board by bouncing. You know, the most they can do is try to OTK us, but again, if we're 18k DP, we just redirect it one time and they die. They don't have protection from battle. It's a bit of a no-brainer. The only issue I can really see is tempo. You know, if they kill us too fast and we just didn't see the pieces we need, it can always be a problem. That is any deck's problem, not just Tyrants. Nume is going to be a really interesting one. Again, I haven't tested it, but we're not sure if we'll see it drop off with such monster decks coming out with like Magna and Tyrant that really, you know, do their best to just block out the board and control everything before doing these huge OTKs. But it could definitely out-tempo bugs. It's really just a question of whether you get an Izzy, a Meta Life, and a Tyrant down quickly enough to be able to bot deck all of your opponent's little slug boys, which is huge because that means you just don't have to delete them. They don't get their on deletion effects. They don't get to play out all this stuff. Yes, you're going to have to swing over 1 or 2 of them, but most importantly, every single turn that once you establish your bug, you're going to be able to bot deck every single turn, at least one of them. And obviously the ones that remain could never hit over debug. It feels a little bit skewed in Tyrant's favor. So there's probably a few other decks that we could talk about, but it's not worth going over every single matchup. But I just want to say, I think it has really good matchups into the new format with some of the new decks coming out, and I think it has really good matchups into some of the older decks. But that's really kind of the vibe when we're talking about a format that hasn't released yet. We can only talk in our own opinions about what decks are good until a format has started and we've seen a bunch of tournament breakdowns and what decks are topping and all of that. So the strengths and weaknesses of the deck. Let's start with the strengths. Bugs does such a crazy job of controlling every aspect that needs to be, and Bandai's done a really great job design-wise of making sure that you're not outed by some random Digimon you can't interact with that comes out of raising. Sure, this allows your opponent to try to get their ins against your Tyrant and get past him to get to your security, but they often have to pay a really hefty cost to do so. Some decks actually just can't even out this guy, which is so funny. It can be a real litmus test on what decks have the out. Yes, we've been talking so much specifically about Tyrant as a card that can really make your board unbreakable when you're ahead, but it really deserves its dues, as a lot of the time you are able to just get into the Tyrant and then we work back down to the smaller Digimon, and those Digimon facilitate him specifically. And when you're ahead, the board is completely unbreakable, and then as your opponent starts to do their best to crack back and get back on the board, every other card you have in your deck really works together super well to catch you up if you're in a bind. Secondly, you can have a surprising amount of aggression in this deck too. Cards like Grand Quagga and even starter deck Lotmon can really give this deck a surprisingly heavy hit to your opponent to put them even more so on the clock than they already are. And a last quick strength of this deck I want to add is that when you're deep in the mind of a bug, buzzing around your opponent's head like a fly getting to them, getting down to it, the deck is so simple. And I think it's worth it as a strength of its own that in a competitive scene, you don't have to make the same kind of insane combo decisions. You can really often at times just go, me bug, hit your little mega, and get away with it. One of the first weaknesses that comes to mind is that this deck essentially has no card draw whatsoever. Outside of trainings and memory boosts, Modimon offers us no card draw for what I think is really an insanely powerful effect that works so well with the deck. None of the level 4s or 3s give any card draw. I'm sure that there are some that you could maybe add that do give card draw, but we're essentially dumping a huge part of our hand to facilitate our combo. And if that gets answered really quickly, we can have some issues here and there down the track because of this. You know, maybe we just didn't find another piece to make our second stack because we only had 4 cards in hand. Secondly, to tag on to the end of said weakness, this is a stack deck through and through. Your most important combo and end board are digivolving from level 3 to level 6 and playing out another big guy. If you don't see what you need when you need it in your gripper, it can become a real struggle fest. This deck is easy as fuck. You just gotta make sure you're clearing your opponent's board more so than just hitting security. That really is this deck as a whole. Again, it's a control deck more than it is aggression. So in conclusion, should you play Insectoids? Yes! This deck has so many fun interactions, ways to play around your opponents. It's super easy to grab, and it's even more fun to watch the light in your opponent's die as the great bug infests their mind. So thank you again for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. This has been a bit of obsession, a labor of love once again. I really do love falling down these rabbit holes and just obsessing over a deck until I make a video about it. It's a lot of fun. I just want to give a quick shout out to Caleb. He's a really great deck builder. He made the deck list that I've been using both to playtest and to show you as an example in this. I'm always thankful for him making these really good deck lists that I can sort of iterate on as a player more than a deck builder for the most part. And obviously, thank you everybody else who watches these and always gives me like positive feedback. I really enjoy that. Again, I'll be working on a D-Brigade video coming in the future, hopefully, because that's another one of the decks that I'll be hyper obsessing about coming into the BT16 format. I think it's a really good newbie friendly deck, and I think it is just a great deck in general. So stay tuned for that. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye.